Hello, everyone. My name is Paige, and I'm an intern at Nonviolence International. Today, I have the pleasure to interview Joanne Sheehan for our Spotlight series. Joanne has been a long-time organizer, nonviolence trainer, and educator. She is the co-founder of the War Resisters League office in New England, as well as Voluntown Peace Trust. Joanne, would you like to introduce yourself further and talk a little bit about War Resisters League and Voluntown Peace Trust?
Sure. Thanks, Paige. I'm glad to be here. I've been a nonviolent activist and a nonviolence trainer for well over 50 years now. And my basic kind of political home has been War Resisters League. I did live in Voluntown at the Community for Nonviolent Action in the late 70s, at which point I got very immersed in doing training here in New England, and particularly around actions such as the occupation of the Seabrook nuclear power plant, which I've done a fair amount of writing on. I'm not a founder of Voluntown Peace Trust right now. I'm the president, chair of the board, and very active there. And they have a long history with War Resisters League. And actually, one of the things that they should be recognized for is that the training that they did, particularly during the 1960s, is really pretty foundational for a lot of people in particularly the disarmament movement, but their links with the civil rights movement were very strong. And that is where Barbara Deming, who I hope we get to talk about, really learned about nonviolence and then kind of grew into the feminist nonviolent activist that we later, knew her to be. So, really glad. I also want to say that I've been very active with War Resisters International. I think for me, I have really developed a deeper understanding of nonviolence by working with the international community. And by working with War Resisters International, I've been one of the editors of the Handbook for Nonviolent Campaigns. And so I think that because I feel that the efficient nonviolent actions are done most within a campaign and not just one-off actions, although there are times when we need to do that kind of thing. So I think that commitment to training and campaign development is something that I've been very involved in.
Great. Thank you for that overview. Today, we'll be using this interview time in order to talk about more about your experience with nonviolence resistance, as well as what do we need to do to make nonviolent action more proactive, particularly in the United States. So, and you mentioned Deming, which is great. So, going off of that, you began your advocating in the midst of the 1960s and 70s. How did rising feminism, Barbara Deming, and other feminist actors affect your perception of nonviolence and then affect your advocacy for it?
Yeah, good question. Well, I should start by saying I went to an all-women's college in the late 60s, which is a great experience for me. I think that it really helped me develop as somebody who could really kind of find my voice within find my voice at all, but particularly within the activist community. I had been involved in civil rights work in high school, and then my college years were 66 to 70. So that really was at as the Vietnam War was, at the height of the Vietnam War, really. And so I became more and more active in that as well. I was deeply influenced by nonviolence by Martin Luther King Jr., by Thomas Merton, by a lot of people while I was in college, and then moved to New York City in 1970. And certainly by that point in time, was defining myself as a feminist, was involved in feminist consciousness raising groups, was very involved politically, had a growing connection to War Resisters League at that period of time. And so what I found was Barbara Deming was one of the voices describing nonviolence at that point in time. And so a number of us young feminists were reading Barbara literally off, mimeograph articles and things that were printed in Win magazine and Liberation and things that she was writing. And I think one of the things that's important about Barbara's writings is that they were so accessible. They were essays. We didn't have to wait for the next book to come out. That she did open letters to people. She did talks. She did articles. And she was always very personal and very political at the same time. And I think that drew a lot of us who are looking at feminism in that kind of holistic approach and developing not only our nonviolent action, but our processes for how we work together. So I think that feminism really changed organizations like the War Resisters League in terms of becoming more non-hierarchical, becoming more participatory, listening to all the voices in the room, and having that kind of a process. And I think then feminism continued to influence nonviolent action in terms of looking at the affinity groups that developed around the occupation of the nuclear power plant in Seabrook, how Clamshell Alliance kind of restructured really how we do actions using consensus decision-making in affinity groups, and putting all of that together. You know, we know women's consciousness raising groups were one of the inspirations for affinity groups. I think there are a number of things that Barbara said about nonviolence that still I hold very close. And I think one is, you know, that nonviolence is an exploration, one that has just begun. Now, she came into nonviolence in 1960, when it really still was in its first 20 years of exploration and development in this country, having been really brought over from India by Black activists who were working to end segregation and oppressive, cultural norms and racism. And so, but that began somewhat in the early 40s. It really wasn't until the 50s that we saw Montgomery and some of the other actions in 1960 with the lunch counter sit-ins. And so she got very involved at a very interesting time. But then later she talked about that exploration being really enhanced and developed by women involved more in nonviolence and nonviolent action, and really exploring what that really meant. And Barbara talked about nonviolence as being a two-handed approach. And I think that's I know Nonviolence International uses that. And I think that many of us in our understanding of reaching out and seeing people's humanity, and at the same time stopping them and protecting ourselves, kind of how we use those two hands. So I think even people who don't know much about Barbara kind of are familiar with some of the things that she taught us, certainly. And I think I want to, be one of the people who helps raise up her, more of her writings and more of what she has brought us, because I think that she's, wouldn't say gone out of fashion, but I think that there are a lot of women in the movement who made a big difference at one point in time, and who are not recognized any longer, or recognized very much, or that people say, oh yeah, that woman who read that, or you had that quote, but haven't gone back and really read or reread some of her materials, which I've been doing lately, which I think has been very helpful.
Great. Thank you for so much for going over that connection. I think that's amazing to think about bringing Barbara's writings and her literature into the modern era and stuff. I feel like feminism and nonviolence still has a lot of interconnection, since I feel like feminism today includes more of a stance on equality for all. Right. So I feel like that ties into a lot of nonviolent action. So I think it's great that we can look back to especially women who've expressed, who've been part of nonviolence, who've advocated it since the beginning. So that's really amazing that she's had that influence.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, to go back to her earlier writings before she identified as a feminist, is how she embraced both the disarmament movement and the civil rights movement. She got very involved in both. And she saw them as one and the same. She saw that interconnection. And one of the people that she talks about having spent time with in the 60s when she was on a walk in the South is Reverend James Lawson, who was also somebody who saw those connections and still sees those connections. And so I think that long before, we talked about intersection and kind of understood more what was meant by intersectionality, that there are a lot of people, and I think Barbara was certainly one of them, who really saw the interconnection of the issues. And I think a foundational piece of that was that all of these issues were addressed through the use of nonviolence and nonviolent action and a nonviolent perspective, but that the interconnections of, those levels of violence and oppression and kind of the how they were brought to us in so many different ways, whether that be individual races in the South or they are all systems and structures, but they all have people within them, and how we work with those people, how we listen to those people, how we attempt to engage or put pressure on them is important to kind of see that there are intersections there.
Great. And then going off of the idea that nonviolent action is the solution to these problems, how would you define nonviolent action and what makes it really effective?
Well, I think that, as somebody who really believes in the importance of doing campaigns, I think that there are steps and processes in aiming for having a goal where we really want to see nonviolent social change, right? And that certainly nonviolent direct action, meaning civil disobedience, is not the first thing we think of. It's not the first thing we should pull out of our toolbox, right? It's not the first thing to kind of sit down and say, if you don't do this, I'm going to sit in the road here. Although there are maybe times when we need to sit in the road when something quickly is happening. But to look at that effort to make those changes and then recognize there are some points in time where direct action is really needed to force the issue, to get people to pay attention, as Martin Luther King talked about in his letter from a Birmingham jail, that it really is to kind of wake people up and to put pressure on the opponents, but also wake people up on our own side. And sometimes it takes that kind of an action. It takes that level of commitment to have people really understand this is serious, this needs to change, and people are willing to take a risk to make that happen. But yet no one is willing to risk another person's life or well-being to make that happen. So that's an important piece of this. It's not just about taking action, it's about how do we take that action, which I think is why I feel very committed to doing nonviolence training, because I feel like engaging in this is not something we normally do. And sometimes when people are moved to take action, it's out of anger. It's like, and that's okay. I mean, I think that's one of the things that feminism has taught me is that it's not the anger that's wrong. It's how we use the anger against someone that becomes the problem, right? And so we often need to think about, okay, how do we, because we're angry at the injustice, so how do we prepare ourselves for engaging in this nonviolent action in a way that is respectful of that other, the humanity of the other, and needs to be practiced. We have to practice nonviolence in order to practice nonviolence.
Yeah, that's a great point to put, is rather than just being somebody who sits on the sidelines, kind of watches and supports from afar, and it's important to be an actor and be involved and actually be part of that. I saw a lot in your works. You referenced some of Gandhi's ideas, and you can correct me any time that I'm wrong, but for a necessary movement, you talked about how Gandhi said that you needed a change in yourself, in your personal life, in political action, and then also as part of constructive program. And I was wondering if you would put nonviolence training and under this constructive program idea.
Oh, interesting question. Because I'm working with a group of people in War Resisters International right now on developing a handbook for people wanting to engage more in constructive program and kind of what elements, dimensions of society people are trying to change. For example, I'm very active in the community land trust movement. We have created community land trust, including affordable housing and the like. So permanently affordable housing. So yeah, it's interesting you ask that question, because I'm working with a group in War Resisters International writing a handbook on constructive program and how do we prepare for that? Because constructive program is very different from nonviolent action. And sometimes the people who engage in nonviolent action are a different group of people, then some people are drawn to the protest aspect of things. Some people are drawn to kind of creative development of those alternatives. So a lot of us are involved in both, but not all of us are. But clearly, there are things that people need to learn about constructive program. And one of the core pieces that we have kind of identified and been talking about is that there are underlying values that are important in terms of really values of nonviolence. How do we define these values? How do we do this nonviolently? How do we do this taking into account equity? How do we do it taking into account kind of empowerment of people, right? This isn't just like, go off and create some Band-Aid, right? This is creating really a new society in the shell of the old. And so how do we change our attitudes about doing that work? How do we look at the different skills that are needed? How do we look at the kind of organizing work needed to help people do kind of the support? And this is long haul work, right? If you're going to create permanently affordable housing with a 99-year renewable lease, it's not a short campaign. It's not will we win this or will we shut this down now? Even though when we look at shutting down a nuclear power plant or a pipeline, it takes a long time. This is really kind of work for the future. And so it does. And I think it's as crucial as the other nonviolent campaign work that we do. And that it needs to be done with those radical values there. So we don't just kind of tweak something and then eventually just get absorbed into the system again. Because we've seen a lot of really good things happen over the decades that I think have been absorbed into the system and then really lose the power that they have to make social change.
Of course. Would you be able to provide an example of that?
Yeah, I think an example is work around domestic violence and work around battered women's shelters, which were started by grassroots women in particularly the late 60s and early 70s, who saw a real need for how do we provide an alternative to help get women out of this battering situation, right? And then, like any problem like that, we also need to look at the root causes of this, right? And so what are the root causes and how do we talk to young people about issues of bullying and discrimination and kind of battering others, and those kinds of discussions can be hard and should be radical. And I know of programs that started out radically, but then don't want to really get down to the depths of some of those kinds of issues, right? They don't want to address the white kid who thinks he can rule the classroom, which is mostly kids of color, right? So I know of programs where they've gone into the schools and tried to address some of these issues, but the funders don't quite believe that. Or maybe we shouldn't be talking about nonviolence, or you're going to talk about queer issues, and so rather than saying, yes, that is at the root of this, that idea of domination, how do we help these kids look at a different way, then I think then what's happening is that we have a Band-Aid situation. We just keep making more abusers come along, and we need more money to put more money to put more women into safe spaces. And I think that's one of the serious problems with something that gets a lot of funding from the government, gets a lot of funding from the military. If you live near a military base like I do, the Navy gives money to these programs because there are a lot of women who are battered by their spouses. We know that battering, that police have a higher incidence of battering than many other people in many other jobs. So those very people are called on to kind of help are actually often the problem. But because those organizations have become so much a part of the system and the structure and get money from the feds, and they should be supported, but then what compromises do you make when you are doing that?
I think that's a really good question, because a lot of nonviolence is connected to our values. And I wonder if education has anything to do with it. You know, you were talking about addressing these core issues, or that organizations will not address certain really core structural issues because out of fear that they won't be able to operate without
That's right.
for being too, for being too active. So I wonder if any sort of education ideas would help in that, but I understand, it's part of an entire system that could largely use some changes.
Right, because you educate the funders, you educate everybody, right? And then you do need to look seriously at these militarized structures that we call on, right? It's like, oh, a woman's getting battered, we'll bring in the police. Well, it might be that cops, somebody in that force who's beating that woman, right? We have to look at that reality. Is that really the answer to how we protect women, is to bring in someone with a gun who works for a police force that has a high number of batterers working for it? Those kinds of things are very large kinds of problems. And so I think one of the questions does become, how do we support these endeavors without those kinds of compromises or seeking? We know since George Floyd's murder in particular, when people are looking at, what does defund the police mean? And I think one of the things, it doesn't mean not have any police. It means really rethink this and really rethink how do we protect ourselves and how do we help, what are those systems of protection? And oftentimes recognizing that when we bring the people in with the guns, they're not protecting at all. And that what are the other options that we can, that we need to develop, that we need to fund, that we need to build up. So I think that there are a lot of folks, in the progressive movements who are doing this kind of work, people's budgets and all of this on very local levels, as well as we have a national conversation about it, right? And so I think that we need to engage in that kind of with our nonviolent lenses on, and we need to engage in it with our constructive program kind of toolkit, because it may be that some of these options need to be really revamped and really different kinds of structures and systems need to be brought into play here. There's restorative justice practices that are being developed. There's a lot of other things that are being developed that I think communities are looking at now. But I think a lot of this does get back to how can we look at root causes? And I think that's kind of the radical aspect of things, right? How do we look at root causes? And for some people, that just shakes their foundation so much that then becomes, problematic.
Mm-hmm. And I see in this way, like when it comes to talking about dismantling systems, I think one of the biggest issues we have with actually pushing that forward is people who are taken advantage from those systems or are given privilege by those systems, who also have power in those systems.
That's right.
Very difficult to overcome that if actors within it, because you brought up defunding the police. I know a lot of individuals label that as too radical, that having no police, kind of took it to that extreme. Saying that, there was just going to be chaos and everything, but not actually listening to the idea that maybe we need to look at our police system, how we train police officers, who we hire our police officers, and who we give this power to. And how do we really determine that? And are we doing it in a right way? Because by looking at all the violence against Black people and people of color by the police, it's telling me that it's not done right. So
That's right. You can't just retrain people who have this deep ingrained hate. or suspicion of other people, or kind of a macho dominating kind of headset, right? Like more needs to be done than that. And those are the people who are most protected, you know, by the police brotherhoods, as they are called. And so even though I know that there are people who try to go into that system in order to change it, I think that's very difficult from a lot of the examples that I see around where I live. You know, when older Black officers are still harassed, so you want to encourage young women of color to go into this police force? How will they fare in all of that? You know, what kind of abuse and trauma will they go through being in those kinds of systems? You know, if those systems don't radically change.
Yeah, and I think because that's almost the argument, you know, like go into the belly of the beast to fight it and stuff. But really, it's hard for you to just not end up becoming part of that system, right, victim of it. So, yeah, I think I definitely agree. Just sending, you know, saying like, oh, well, let's just put more marginalized individuals in the police force. Well, they will just end up facing discrimination and possible abuse themselves. So, but going off of bringing up BLM and then just talking about social change movements in general, I think this movement, we saw an incredible amount of people, particularly in America, petitioning to their representatives for change and being part of protests all around. But we still haven't really seen significant policy change in reforming the police and really adjusting police brutality, or even looking at our systems of oppression in America. So wondering why hasn't this brought about real policy change in your opinion?
Right. Well, yeah. It's, you know, I think the most change that has happened in the last few years has been cultural change. I do think that if you when we pay attention to how, you know, people in the entertainment world are becoming more aware of the changes that are needed, of having that people of color, it's not just a matter of put them in some of our plays, right? It's a matter of what plays are put out there. Who makes the decisions at all, on all levels? People need to be welcomed in, you know, that's not, you know, that there are these so many aspects of our cultural lives and that need to be questioned and challenged and changed. And I do think I see that happening. That's not enough, but I see that happening, and I see those kinds of challenges being made, and we see the statues coming down, and we see how people are looking differently at kind of the past. On the other hand, probably because there's been enough effectiveness of that, you know, we see the other end of what's happening in terms of people challenging the education system. We can't teach critical race theory, that we can't kind of teach the truth, that we can't teach our own history. And so those battles are kind of, you know, within this larger context of what's happened from the Obama administration to the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, and kind of all of the other changes that have happened in this country in the last 4, 5, 6 years. And so, yeah, it's disheartening to think that John Lewis and everything that he did has a voting rights bill named for him, and that hasn't been able to get passed. That things that were kind of, you know, the battles that were fought in the civil rights movement, right? We have Martin Luther King Day, and we, you know, say, yay, you know, all these people did great things. And it's like, wait, yeah, but they've all been undermined, or the election system has been undermined, that the right to vote is being taken away from people in various other sneaky ways, and that we as a country that the policies are not changing to rectify that. So that what we do see is people kind of fight that on the grassroots level. We do see people have done nonviolent actions. Congresswomen in the legislative buildings have done nonviolent action. That people are doing that again, and I think that again, it's not these one-off kind of actions that will really make the change. That what we need to do is really engage again in very focused campaigns for the kind of change we need, and the change can't. Policy is one thing. Policy is not going to change without serious grassroots support for that, and making it difficult not to make those changes. And I think a lot of people are exhausted, especially coming out of the Trump era, and now around so many issues. We might see the interconnections of these issues, but yet sometimes we're siloed into what are we doing now? Are we working on voter rights? Are we stopping this pipeline? What is happening? What are the things we're doing? Are we working on defunding the police in our community? Are we trying to build affordable housing through community land trust? There's just so much that's neat. We're at another one of those points in my life, certainly, where there's so much to do that it becomes difficult sometimes to, okay, everybody get on board around climate change now. Everybody get on board about this or that, right? And I think the people as it should be, the people in the lead are the people most affected. But sometimes I feel that we leave them out there to do it on their own while another group of people are doing something else. So yeah, it is a really difficult challenge right now, I think, to see that. And it is a matter of changing hearts and minds as well as policy. And policy is pretty hard to change given the splits that we have in this country now.
Yeah, I feel like I think a lot of people, we've seen through the pandemic, and then, at the same time when that was starting, the BLM movement began with George Floyd's murder. And we were kind of brought at this point where we really, I at least felt for me that we felt incredibly split at that time. It was also during the Trump administration, and it was just a very difficult time. And so, yeah, I feel like at this point, some people feel like it's a never ending battle.
Yeah.
Gathering this focused action is really difficult. I don't know if it could be best done through an organization, if it's best with a few leaders, or how do you go about that? I don't know if you have any ideas. It's a very large question.
Right. I do think I don't think the answer is a few leaders. I do think that there have been times, certainly, we're going to look at Martin Luther King Jr. as the person, when he dies, we'll want to have that leadership. We need to have much more of a sense of grassroots empowerment, much more of a sense of team efforts at leadership. And let's look at Georgia, right? Stacey Abrams is kind of, she's the darling of kind of the media. She is, she's great at really being clear about what the work is, the work they're doing. Stacey Abrams is not the only woman who has been doing this work in Georgia to bring more people of color into voting. That there have been a whole group of mostly Black women who have been doing that. And they knew that they were in it for the long haul. They figured it might take 20 years. It took 10 before they were able to win those senatorial elections in Georgia, right? And so it takes the long haul. It takes a good team. It takes good strategy. It takes an understanding of how to do good organizing. And yes, I think that we always need to look at that tool of nonviolent direct action and how that needs to be used at certain times. But I think that we need to understand that change takes time. When people say, and that to be effective strategy is, right? So I've heard people say, here's two ends of the spectrum. But I went to that demonstration and nothing changed. You went to one demonstration and nothing changed. Well, duh, or I've been vigiling at the street corner for 30 years and I don't see change. well, you're not a threat vigiling at the street corner. You better raise some consciousness. You know, maybe another generation was inspired by your being there. That's not enough, right? And one demonstration isn't enough. So what is enough? How do we do this? You know, we see people who would think of the opposite side, again, having a long haul vision, you know, and kind of being very manipulative about that vision, but understanding change takes a while. And I think that people on the progressive side don't necessarily grasp that as well all the time. And grassroots folks get tired and think, oh, yeah, you know, like, yeah, it's one thing if it's your job. It's another thing because there's not enough jobs. I mean, it isn't the job of most people to make those changes. That's something we do in our spare time, so to speak. And that also speaks to who can do it and who can't do it, because not everyone has spare time. Mm-hmm. Right? Especially lower income people with multiple jobs, people who don't have a car to get to a demonstration. You know, how do we help move people up? So for example, when we have a community land trust meeting, well, when we were having more meetings in person, you know, always do it at a time, always have childcare, always have some food. You're going to do it around dinner time, you know, kind of like make it accessible. Do you need a ride? I'll give you a ride. I'll bring you home. You know, it's really back to those basic kind of things around organizing that brings people out. And I think the other thing is that around, if we're looking at nonviolent action, it's not just the people who risk arrest that are doing that action. It's all the support people who do it as well. And that support, you know, group may include somebody saying, I'll watch the kids so people can get out to the demonstration. If it's not a demonstration where you want the kids there. So it's really looking at what is the whole support mechanism, the person who stays back on the phone to be able to take the calls if people are arrested and separated from their affinity groups or whatever, right? It's all of that, which means you organize a well-organized demonstration, but you don't have a hierarchy of this person's more important than that person within the structure. It takes everybody to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And no, I think that's a great perspective, having that group effort. I wonder how the internet has kind of played a role in making protests a little bit more accessible in some ways, that if you couldn't protest in person or you weren't able to join that group for whatever reason, if you'd still be able to participate online. I know that can still be difficult because even having the internet and having consistent access to the internet is a privilege. And but I wonder, what's your perspective on how that's going?
Yeah, it's both a blessing and a curse, I suppose. Because some people just think, well, if I sign these petitions, if I click they like something in particular, if they read that article, you know, that's their level of activism. And that, again, that doesn't create social change. You know, I think that the politicians understand now that the internet can produce so many petitions that it really has become almost meaningless, right? Where that used to be. I think that congressional offices would see more, if somebody called, if somebody actually sat down and wrote a letter as opposed to signing a petition, that kind of means more people care about this. And I think on some level, and I actually haven't seen as many lately, maybe that's because of other forms of social media, that there are ways we can organize that we couldn't organize before, ways we can get word out about things, ways we can share. While I have really gotten tired of doing so much on Zoom in the pandemic, you know, it's allowed us to have meetings, gatherings, talks, webinars that we didn't even think about before in terms of kind of having a wider audience. It is harder to do trainings. And I remember several years ago, well prior to the pandemic, someone saying, well, my kids are always on their computers, so you have to do your nonviolence training on the computer. And it's like, well, people aren't willing to come out and like do the kind of thing that you need to do face to face in a situation. I can't imagine if people didn't go out on the streets after George Floyd's murder, we would be talking about the aftermath of that murder, right? It can't all be done online, whether it's Facebook or, Zoom or Twitter or whatever. And I think Twitter, because of its speed, has probably been more effective, but we also know that there are such problems with all of those. I think it really does get back out to where's your body on the line. In the long run, we could be signing 1 million petitions and they're still building that pipeline out there. Or Texas is still going to try to roll back voter rights kinds of things. So, it really needs to be a matter of being present as much as we can be in these situations.
Mm-hmm. And I know you touched on this a little bit, and your recent writings have been largely about this, but I was wondering if you wanted to speak on nonviolent action in the Black community as well.
Yeah, I wrote a piece on the roots of nonviolent action is in the Black community in the United States. And I did that because as a trainer, I had just been challenged many times of people saying, well, nonviolence is really only something that white privileged people can engage in. And because most of my, most of the people that I've learned nonviolence from are not white and not privileged. And I think, we look at it, certainly the roots in India, certainly the civil rights movement, was Black-led civil rights movement in this country, the Chicano-led United Farm Workers and that whole movement and their embrace of nonviolence. That really, when you look at it, was Black folks in this country who are looking at how are we going to address the segregation system in this country? How are we going to address racism in this country? And we're looking at what was happening in India with the independence movement there and saying, there's something here. And there are a number of people, Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin. These were all Black men who went over to India and then kind of brought these ideas back, that there are places as early as 1940 with the Harlem Ashram, where men and women, including Polly Murray, came together and really experimented with this nonviolence and began to develop nonviolence training and began to look at, the campaign, the Gandhian campaigns, and say, how would that work here? What would they look like here, right? And then created the Congress of Racial Equality, went on and, developed nonviolent actions, challenged segregated places, won, and just kept building on that, desegregated. I mean, in some of these places are ridiculous, like the Y. Swimming pools we know about, right? Like lunch counters and cafeterias and eventually schools, and kind of using nonviolent action, that was how it was done. So there's an example when you go back to kind of that changing of policy. Policy changed because people stood at the door of the university and said, I'm coming in, I belong here, right? And so we have all of these folks who, Bayard Rustin, Wally Nelson, Juanita Morrow Nelson, Polly Murray, all of these folks who really experimented with and explored and developed nonviolence in terms of nonviolent action, in terms of nonviolent campaigns, in terms of so many successful campaigns. And even though we think of ourselves as in a mess now, they made big changes and big differences that continue to be maintained, right? And so I think that for many of us, like myself, in the white community, that's who we look towards. I think that because history gets lost, and because for some reason that I'm still trying to figure out, the history of nonviolence training is not written into so many of the civil rights histories. We know about Nashville, we know about that training, but we don't know about most of them. And I think that's a great loss, because I think when young people of color are looking towards what models they have, they don't see that because it's not there. It's not visible in terms of kind of, that power of nonviolence. It's not simply about turning the other cheek or sitting there and getting beaten. that there is a power and a resilience to doing nonviolent action. It's not about not doing anything, which I think is kind of, because it looks like that sometimes, depending on what actually the action is. So I do think that there are, among everybody, there are a lot of misunderstandings about what nonviolence is. It's not quite as militant as what? As breaking windows, as what else, right? On the other hand, we understand justifiable anger. We understand that a lot of people who have been oppressed, a lot of people who watched George Floyd's murder, those horrible 8.5 minutes, are rightfully angry. But we also know that that level of anger does not sustain itself, and it does not sustain a movement. And that to continue to make those changes, we've got to get constructive with what we're doing, or we've got to kind of be strategic with what we're doing. And I think that that's probably easier for me to say than a lot of other folks, but I do look at and continue to have inspiration and continue to try to kind of help bring out some of that history in order for everybody to understand that history, just like I do around Barbara Deming and the kind of work that she brings out.
Mm-hmm. Coming to an end to the interview, I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me and discussing your experience with nonviolence resistance. I think your work has been very inspiring, and I'm glad that we have this opportunity to have this discussion and inform others on nonviolence and proactive action just through our discussion and kind of get people thinking. I was wondering if there was anything else you wanted to add to this discussion, or even a message maybe to youth activists out there who are looking for guidance as they continue their activism.
Well, recently with the Voluntown Peace Trust, we posted an article about an action, a nonviolent action that was done in support of the people of Vieques, Puerto Rico, who at the time were in the early 2000s were mounting a major nonviolent campaign to get the Navy, who was doing bombing practice on their island, to get them out of there. And because I'd been working with young folks in a local high school here in a youth peace group, we took a carload of them up to Hartford. They really cared about this issue. They wanted to be allies. I had been working with the Puerto Rican group that was organizing this demonstration. We brought them out there. And then we did an article last month on Voluntown Peace Trust on our Facebook page. And one of the young women, well, she's not a young woman anymore, she's in her 40s now, one of the women who had been part of that group back then posted that was the first time she'd ever seen nonviolent direct action happen, and how that moved her and changed her as she saw that power of people sitting in front of that recruiting station, which was the place that most represented the military in Hartford at the time, and how that moved her to be more supportive of the issue and as people were taking those risks. So I realized that oftentimes people have not had, a lot of young people have not had these experiences. After George Floyd's murder, lots of new groups popped up of people who had never seen a demonstration were suddenly organizing demonstrations. And so I think that as a member of an organization that's multi-generational, I believe in mutual mentoring, that it's a matter of how do we share some of these tools, this practice that has been developed by many, many people beyond ourselves. How do we share that? And also, how do we listen to young people who have different experiences and who want to be able to share those experiences and hopefully move forward so that there is a more empowered group of folks who feel like they have that sense of being able to do something. Because I had that when I was young. I had that because Vietnam War was going on. So when we're in the midst of a crisis, those opportunities are there. And I think it's really, for me, having been trained by older people who had been in the civil rights movement, was really important. And I feel like that's kind of my responsibility to to continue to pass that on and pass those stories on and provide those opportunities. But it's also important that we never do this, yeah, but you have to do it my way. We've always done it this way kind of thing, and that we don't really understand that revolutionary nonviolence might look differently at different times. And I think that's a really important lesson.
Great. Thank you so much again, Joanne, for meeting with me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for doing this. I think that this is it's a great opportunity to, share this and have conversations. Thanks for your questions.
If you think these conversations are important and would like to see them continue, please consider supporting NVI and the work we do by subscribing to this YouTube channel, following us on Twitter and Facebook, and visiting our website. Also, please consider donating to NVI using the link in the description. We appreciate your support and dedication to creating a nonviolent world.